The day that didn't feel like celebration. The morning air above the Italian coast was calm, almost reverent, the kind of stillness that usually followed a storm rather than preceded a celebration. Sunlight filtered through tall cypress trees, casting long, thoughtful shadows across the white stone villa perched above the sea. Somewhere below, waves touched the shore in a rhythm so steady it felt like a heartbeat, slow, patient, alive. It was supposed to be a perfect day, the kind of day magazines later describe as storybook. Yet inside the villa, something fragile hovered beneath the elegance, something unseen but deeply felt. Tom Cruise stood alone near a wide glass window, dressed in a tailored suit that fit him flawlessly but felt heavier than it should have. From the outside, the world would see confidence, achievement, success shaped by decades of discipline and determination. But inside, his reflection stared back with questions he hadn't answered in years. Today was meant to close a chapter, to bring certainty, to quiet the endless movement of a life spent always reaching forward. Instead, his heart felt unusually still, not peaceful, just uncertain. Behind him, Ana de Armas moved softly through the room, her presence gentle rather than commanding. She wore no excessive jewelry, no dramatic expression, only a calm grace that came from self-awareness rather than performance. She had learned long ago that love wasn't proven by grand gestures but by emotional honesty. As she watched Tom stand in silence, she sensed the distance not between them but within him. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, a man standing at the edge of a truth he hadn't yet named. Outside the gates, cameras waited, voices murmured. Expectations built themselves into something loud and impatient. The world loved moments like this because they appeared complete. A beginning, a conclusion, a victory, but real life, Ana knew, rarely followed such neat lines. Then something unexpected shifted the air. A single car arrived without announcement. No fanfare, no press release, just presence. Two figures stepped out calmly, dressed simply, moving without urgency or performance. There was something unmistakably grounding about them, as if they carried silence with them rather than noise. When people recognized them, reactions softened instead of escalating. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock didn't arrive as stars. They arrived as something rarer, witnesses. They weren't on any official guest list. They hadn't announced themselves. Yet no one stopped them, not because of fame, but because of the calm certainty in their steps. They walked side by side, not speaking much, sharing the kind of quiet understanding that grows between people who have survived the same storms without needing to explain them. When Tom turned and saw them, his posture changed. Not surprise, relief. Keanu didn't say much when he reached him. He simply placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, firm but gentle, the way someone does when words would only complicate what the heart already knows. "You're here," Keanu said softly. "That's enough for today." Tom exhaled, the kind of breath people release when they've been holding themselves together for too long. Sandra stood nearby, watching with eyes that had learned to read emotional weather better than headlines ever could. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She simply offered presence, the rarest gift in a world obsessed with commentary. The ceremony began as planned. Music floated across the courtyard. Guests smiled. Vows were spoken with sincerity. Yet beneath the beauty, something deeper unfolded quietly, a realization forming in the space between glances, pauses, and unsaid thoughts. Sandra noticed it first. Not a flaw, not doubt, something more human. A man realizing that peace doesn't arrive on schedule. As applause filled the air, Keanu didn't clap right away. He watched Tom carefully, not with judgment, but with recognition. He had seen this moment before, not in movies, but in real lives. Moments where success stood proudly on the outside while the soul lagged behind, waiting to be acknowledged. Later, when the celebration drifted inward and laughter grew louder, Tom stepped outside alone into the garden where soft lights hung between olive branches. The world behind him sparkled. The world within him remained unfinished. Keanu followed quietly. They stood together without speaking for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Finally, Tom spoke. "Do you ever feel like you did everything right?" he asked, voice low, and still missed something important. Keanu didn't rush his answer. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "we chase certainty when what we really need is honesty." Before Tom could reply, Sandra appeared with 2 warm cups of tea, offering one without explanation. "Some days," she said gently, "listening is more powerful than fixing." Tom accepted the cup, hands slightly unsteady. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not as a symbol, not as a success story, but as a human being standing at a crossroads he couldn't ignore. And somewhere beyond the lights, beyond the cameras, beyond the expectations of a watching world, something began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet force that only truth carries. The night continued, but the real story had only just begun. The weight of silence. Night did not arrive suddenly at the villa. It settled slowly, like a thought that refuses to be ignored. The laughter inside softened into murmurs, music faded into background hums, and the sea below reflected fragments of moonlight that looked almost broken, as if even the water carried questions. Tom stood again near the same glass doors, watching reflections blur together, faces, lights, movement, none of it touching him the way it should have on a night meant to celebrate beginnings. The ring on his finger felt heavier now, not as a burden, but as a reminder that promises did not magically resolve the wars already happening inside a person. Ana noticed the change before anyone else because she was listening with more than her ears. She had learned, through her own life, that love was not proven by how loudly someone stayed, but by how honestly they faced themselves. When she joined Tom quietly, she did not accuse him, did not ask him to perform happiness for her comfort. Instead, she stood beside him, allowing silence to exist without fear. That silence spoke more truth than applause ever could, and within it, Tom realized something unsettling. He had spent years mastering motion, momentum, and perfection, yet had avoided stillness because stillness asked questions he didn't know how to answer. From across the room, Keanu watched without intrusion, his presence calm but alert, the way someone watches waves not to control them, but to understand when the tide is changing. He had learned long ago that moments like these were not dramatic turning points, but quiet thresholds, the kind people either cross honestly or spend a lifetime circling around. Sandra stood beside him, her expression thoughtful, not worried, because worry seeks control while understanding waits patiently. She sensed that this night was not about celebration, but recognition, and recognition often arrives dressed as discomfort. When Tom finally stepped outside into the open air again, the garden felt cooler, quieter, stripped of spectacle. Olive trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches unmoved by the expectations placed upon the evening. Keanu joined him without announcement, not following, not leading, simply arriving where he was needed. They stood together as equals rather than icons, the world temporarily distant enough to let truth breathe. Tom spoke slowly, as if testing the weight of each word before releasing it, admitting that he had hoped this marriage would quiet something restless inside him, that he believed love could function like a finish line rather than a living process. Keanu listened fully before responding, because some truths collapse if rushed. He told Tom that peace does not arrive through achievement or ceremony, but through alignment, through the difficult work of letting who you are match how you live. He spoke of how silence isn't the enemy, but the messenger, and how ignoring it only makes it return louder. Tom felt something loosen at those words, not relief yet, but permission to admit that he didn't have answers, that he was tired of being admired for strength while privately struggling to feel grounded. Sandra joined them carrying warmth rather than advice, offering tea like an anchor rather than a solution. She spoke gently, reminding Tom that being strong did not mean being finished, and that vulnerability was not a crack in character but a doorway to growth. Her words did not instruct, they illuminated. Tom realized that no one here was asking him to change for approval, only to stop hiding from himself, and that realization carried both comfort and fear because truth always does. Inside the villa, guests continued celebrating, unaware that something more important was happening beyond the lights. Ana watched from a distance, not out of suspicion but respect, understanding that love sometimes requires space rather than control. She knew Tom needed this moment not to escape commitment, but to understand what commitment truly meant, and she trusted that honesty would bring clarity whether it led toward or away from comfort. Later that night, when the celebration finally thinned and the world outside quieted, Tom sat alone on the balcony overlooking the sea, the sounds of waves steady and unchanging, unlike his thoughts. He realized that for years he had confused movement with progress, attention with meaning, and perfection with peace. Now, in the presence of people who expected nothing from him except authenticity, those illusions began to fade. Keanu and Sandra joined him one last time before retreating indoors, leaving behind not advice, but something far more valuable, the feeling that he was not alone in facing himself. As dawn approached, the villa rested under a sky that shifted from darkness to pale blue, and Tom understood that this wedding had not resolved his journey but had revealed it. He did not feel broken nor complete, but aware that real change does not begin with grand decisions, but with quiet acceptance of what has been avoided for too long. Somewhere inside, a fragile sense of peace flickered, not because everything was settled, but because for the first time in a long while he had stopped running from the questions. And as the sun rose over the sea, casting light across the same glass doors he had stood beside so many times before, Tom realized that the day ahead would test everything he had just begun to understand, and that the presence of two quiet friends, who chose integrity over noise and compassion over spectacle, might be the only reason he would face it with honesty instead of fear. When the world knocks too loud. Morning arrived without ceremony, as it often does after nights heavy with truth. The villa slowly filled with pale light, revealing details that had been invisible under celebration, the faint cracks in stone, the scattered petals, the stillness left behind when noise departs. Tom woke early, not because he was rested, but because sleep had refused to hold him. The weight in his chest was not panic nor regret, but awareness, the kind that settles in once illusions begin to dissolve. He stepped onto the balcony again, breathing in the salt air, realizing that the sea never hurried to explain itself, and yet it remained whole, steady, honest. Behind him, Ana slept quietly, her expression calm, untouched by the unrest inside him. Watching her, Tom felt both gratitude and fear, gratitude for her patience, fear that he might not yet be able to meet her openness with the same clarity. He understood now that love did not demand certainty, but it demanded presence, and presence required him to stop hiding behind roles he had perfected over decades. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that the image the world praised had grown heavier than the man who carried it. By mid-morning, the outside world began to stir, and with it came the inevitable pull of attention. Phones vibrated, messages stacked upon one another, and distant voices reminded him that silence was rarely respected when it contradicted expectation. Tom ignored them all, choosing instead to walk the garden paths where shadows shifted slowly, grounding himself in something real. It was there that Keanu found him, not with urgency, but with the same quiet timing that had defined every moment since his arrival. They walked together without destination, the kind of movement that exists for reflection rather than arrival. Keanu spoke about pressure, not as something imposed by others, but as something we internalize long before anyone demands it. He told Tom that the world will always ask for performance because performance is easy to consume, but integrity is difficult to watch because it forces reflection. Tom listened, realizing how often he had mistaken approval for connection, and how rarely he had allowed himself to be fully seen by anyone who wasn't applauding. The realization did not shame him. It steadied him, like finally naming a quiet ache that had gone untreated. Sandra joined them later, bringing with her a grounding presence that softened the intensity without diminishing its truth. She spoke about choice, about how every life eventually presents a moment where continuing the familiar becomes more painful than facing the unknown. She reminded Tom that stepping back was not failure, and that redefining success was not betrayal of one's past, but respect for one's future. Her words did not urge him toward a decision. They invited him toward honesty, and that invitation lingered long after the conversation ended. Inside the villa, Ana felt the shift even without hearing the words exchanged outside. She moved through the rooms thoughtfully, touching familiar objects, sensing that something essential was unfolding beyond her control. When Tom finally returned, their conversation was not dramatic, not emotional in the way stories often expect, but careful, measured, sincere. He told her that he was learning to listen to himself without fear, and she told him that she had never needed perfection from him, only truth. They spoke as equals, without accusation, without defense, and in that balance, something fragile but genuine began to form. Yet the world did not pause for their understanding. By afternoon, speculation reached the gates, carried by curiosity rather than cruelty, but loud enough to test resolve. Tom felt the familiar pull to respond, to explain, to manage perception before it hardened into narrative. This time, however, he hesitated, remembering Keanu's quiet certainty and Sandra's reminder that peace does not require permission. He chose silence not as avoidance, but as protection, a decision that felt unfamiliar and therefore frightening, but also deeply necessary. As evening approached, the sky darkened again, clouds gathering slowly as if mirroring the internal tension that had not yet resolved. Keanu and Sandra prepared to leave, sensing that their role was not to stay indefinitely, but to remind, then step back. Before they departed, Tom thanked them not for advice, but for presence, for choosing humanity over spectacle, and for showing him that strength could be gentle without becoming fragile. Sandra embraced Ana with warmth, whispering that patience is not passive, but one of the strongest forms of love. When their car disappeared down the long road, the villa felt quieter than ever before, but this time the quiet did not feel empty. Tom stood beside Ana beneath the darkening sky, understanding that the next steps would be difficult, that clarity often demands courage long after inspiration fades. He did not know where the path would lead, only that he could no longer walk it divided between who he was and who he pretended to be. That night, as rain began to fall softly against stone and glass, Tom remained awake, listening not to the storm but to himself. He understood now that the world would continue to knock loudly, demanding certainty, celebration, explanation, but the most important voice was finally speaking from within, and whether he answered it with fear or faith would shape everything that followed. The storm outside grew steadier, washing the air clean, while somewhere deep inside, a far more difficult cleansing had begun, one that could not be undone, only honored. And as the villa settled into darkness once more, the story moved quietly forward, not toward resolution, but toward truth, where the next choice would matter more than any vow spoken aloud. The courage to remain. The rain lasted through the night, not violent, not dramatic, but persistent, as if the sky itself was unwilling to let the world rush forward without reflection. By morning, the villa felt transformed, washed clean of excess, stripped down to stone, air, and quiet. Tom woke to the sound of water dripping from olive leaves outside the window, each drop landing with deliberate patience. For the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone immediately. He lay still, listening, realizing how rare it was for him to begin a day without preparing to respond to someone else's expectations. Ana woke shortly after, sensing his wakefulness without needing to look. They shared the silence naturally, not awkwardly, understanding that some mornings were not meant for conversation. When they finally stepped outside together, the garden carried the scent of rain and earth, grounding and honest. Tom felt exposed without the noise of schedules and demands, but there was something unexpectedly freeing about it. Without performance, without explanation, he felt closer to himself than he had in a long time. As the day unfolded, the outside world grew louder, not in sound but in pressure. Messages waited unanswered, headlines quietly forming without confirmation, narratives shaping themselves regardless of his participation. Tom felt the familiar urge to intervene, to control the direction of the story before it hardened into something unrecognizable. This time, however, he remembered the calm steadiness of Keanu's voice and Sandra's unwavering belief that peace did not require defense. He understood that silence was no longer avoidance. It was a boundary, and boundaries were not walls but acts of self-respect. Ana watched him navigate this tension with careful awareness. She saw the struggle not as weakness, but as transformation, the uncomfortable stage where shedding an old identity feels like loss before it becomes growth. She spoke gently, reminding him that she had chosen him not for certainty, but for sincerity, and that whatever path he chose next, it had to be one he could walk without resentment. Her words did not ask him to stay or leave, to act or retreat. They asked him to be honest, and that honesty felt heavier than any demand the world could place upon him. By afternoon, Tom chose to leave the villa alone, not to escape, but to think without witness. He walked along the coast where waves met rock with quiet persistence, reflecting on how many times he had outrun doubt by accelerating forward, believing motion equaled resolution. Now, standing still, he realized how often unresolved questions had followed him despite every success. He admitted to himself that the life he had built was impressive, but it had grown crowded, leaving little room for reflection or rest. As he walked, memories surfaced, not of awards or milestones, but of moments when he felt most human, unscripted conversations, shared laughter without cameras, silence that did not feel threatening. He recognized a pattern he had long ignored. Whenever life slowed, clarity emerged, and whenever it accelerated, confusion returned. The realization did not condemn his past, it illuminated his future. Back at the villa, Ana prepared dinner without urgency, her movements unhurried, intentional. She understood that waiting was not passive when done with trust. When Tom returned at dusk, soaked by mist and thought, they ate together quietly, not avoiding conversation but allowing it to arrive naturally. He told her that he felt as though he was standing at the edge of something undefined, unsure whether stepping forward meant change or loss. She replied that sometimes growth felt like loss because it required releasing what once protected us, even when it no longer served us. As night settled again, Tom sat alone near the same glass doors where this journey had begun, watching reflections blur as darkness reclaimed the sea. He realized that the courage required now was not dramatic, not visible, but deeply internal, the courage to remain present without certainty, to resist the impulse to perform reassurance for others while still finding it within himself. He understood that whatever decision awaited him would shape not just his public life, but the private peace he was only beginning to recognize. Somewhere far away, Keanu and Sandra continued their own quiet lives, unaware that their presence had left an enduring mark, not through instruction, but through example. They had shown him that integrity could be lived softly, that loyalty did not demand visibility, and that choosing kindness over control was a form of strength rarely celebrated but deeply transformative. As the night deepened, Tom finally allowed himself to rest, not because answers had arrived, but because he no longer feared the questions. The world outside would continue to speculate, to push, to demand clarity before it was earned. Inside, however, something steady had taken root, a willingness to face uncertainty without running from it. And in that stillness, beneath the quiet rhythm of the sea, Tom understood that the next chapter of his life would not be written for approval, but for truth, and that realization, though unsettling, felt like the beginning of genuine freedom. The choice that changes everything. The morning that followed felt different from the ones before it, not because the world had grown quieter, but because Tom had stopped bracing himself against it. Light entered the villa gently, illuminating the space without demanding attention, and for the first time since the wedding, he did not feel the need to define what the day was supposed to be. He sat at the long wooden table overlooking the sea, holding a cup of coffee that had gone untouched, his thoughts no longer racing ahead but settling where they belonged. The silence that once felt heavy now felt deliberate, chosen, as if he had finally stopped mistaking stillness for emptiness. Ana joined him without ceremony, sensing the shift before he spoke. She could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders no longer carried the familiar tension of performance. He told her quietly that something inside him had changed, not suddenly, but decisively, like a door that had been open for years finally closing behind him. He admitted that he had spent most of his life running towards something undefined, believing that momentum itself was proof of purpose, and that now, for the first time, he wanted to choose direction over speed, depth over appearance. Ana listened without interruption, understanding that this was not a confession of doubt, but a declaration of honesty, and honesty, she knew, was the foundation she had always hoped they would stand on. Outside the villa, the world continued as it always did, hungry for clarity it did not earn, eager for conclusions that made sense on paper but rarely in real life. Messages continued to arrive, each one politely requesting certainty, statements, reassurance, narratives that could be packaged and understood quickly. Tom looked at the phone in his hand, aware that responding would be easy, automatic, familiar, but he also knew that once he stepped back into that rhythm, the quiet progress he had made would dissolve beneath obligation. He made a choice then, not impulsive, not dramatic, but firm, choosing to delay explanation in favor of alignment, choosing to answer first to himself rather than to the world. As the day passed, he walked once more along the coast, not searching for answers, but grounding himself in the decision he had already made. He understood now that clarity did not arrive as certainty about outcomes, but as commitment to values, and that those values would guide him more reliably than any plan. He reflected on the presents Keanu and Sandra had offered, how they had never urged him toward a specific path, only toward integrity, and he recognized that their influence lived on precisely because it respected autonomy rather than control. That realization strengthened his resolve, reminding him that the most meaningful guidance often leaves no trace except confidence. When evening arrived, Tom and Ana sat together beneath a sky softened by fading light, the sea stretching endlessly before them. He told her that whatever came next would require patience, not because love was fragile, but because transformation demanded time. She replied that patience was not waiting without movement, but choosing to remain present while growth unfolded, and in that shared understanding, something unspoken settled between them, a mutual agreement to protect honesty even when it complicated comfort. Later that night, Tom finally addressed the world, not with a statement crafted to satisfy speculation, but with restraint, offering only what was true without oversharing what was still forming. He spoke about taking time, about honoring personal clarity, about respecting the difference between public celebration and private growth. The response was immediate and mixed, as it always is when expectations are disrupted. But Tom felt steady in a way he never had before, because for the first time, his actions matched his internal compass. As he stood once more at the glass doors, watching reflections blend into darkness, Tom understood that this choice did not resolve everything, nor did it promise ease. What it offered instead was coherence, the rare alignment between inner life and outward action that transforms pressure into purpose. He knew the next chapter would not be simple, but it would be honest, and that honesty, once chosen, had a way of reshaping every part of life that followed. Far away, in places untouched by cameras or commentary, Keanu and Sandra continued their quiet routines, unaware that their example had helped anchor a moment that would define another person's future. They had not saved him, advised him, or intervened. They had simply reminded him that peace was not something to be earned through achievement, but something to be protected through choice. As night settled fully and the sea reflected nothing but darkness and stars, Tom felt a calm certainty settle in his chest, not because the path ahead was clear, but because he had finally chosen how he wanted to walk it. And in that calm, he realized that the most powerful transformation is rarely visible in the moment it occurs, unfolding instead in silence, guided by courage that does not seek applause, only truth. What remains when the noise fades? Time did not rush to reward Tom for the choice he made, nor did it punish him for stepping away from the familiar rhythm of expectation. Instead, it unfolded slowly, the way real change always does, quietly reshaping daily life without announcement. The days after his decision were not dramatic, but they were honest. Mornings began without alarms demanding immediate performance, afternoons passed without rehearsed responses, and evenings arrived with a kind of tiredness that felt earned rather than extracted. For the first time in years, Tom noticed how different exhaustion felt when it came from presence instead of pressure, when it followed reflection rather than escape. Ana remained beside him, not as someone waiting for certainty to return, but as someone willing to walk through uncertainty without resentment. Their conversations deepened, not because answers suddenly appeared, but because both had stopped pretending that love required completeness. They spoke about fear without assigning blame, about ambition without shame, and about the possibility that growth did not always mean expansion, but sometimes meant refinement. Tom realized that love, when rooted in honesty, did not demand constant reassurance. It asked for consistency, and consistency began with self-respect. The world continued its cycle of attention, gradually shifting focus, as it always does, drawn toward louder stories and simpler conclusions. Tom watched this distance grow with a calm detachment that surprised even him. He understood now that public narratives are designed for consumption, not comprehension, and that clarity, when lived rather than explained, eventually speaks for itself. He returned selectively to work, not driven by urgency, but guided by alignment, choosing projects that reflected who he was becoming rather than who he had been expected to remain. One evening, months later, Tom sat alone on a quiet terrace far from cameras and ceremony, the sea stretching endlessly before him much like it had on the day everything changed. He thought about Keanu and Sandra, not as turning points, but as reminders that strength could be gentle, that loyalty could be quiet, and that living with integrity did not require witness. He understood that their influence had never been about intervention, but about example, and that example had stayed with him precisely because it had not demanded recognition. Ana joined him, resting her head against his shoulder, the silence between them no longer heavy but settled, filled with shared understanding. Tom spoke softly, not as a confession, but as an acknowledgement, admitting that for most of his life he had believed purpose was something to be achieved, conquered, proven. Now he understood that purpose was something to be lived, protected, and occasionally defended from the noise that tried to redefine it. Ana smiled, telling him that the most meaningful journeys are not the ones the world applauds, but the ones that allow us to recognize ourselves without hesitation. As the night deepened, Tom reflected on how easily life could have continued as before, polished, celebrated, and quietly misaligned. He did not regret his past. It had shaped him, taught him discipline, resilience, and responsibility. What he released was not success, but the illusion that success alone could provide peace. In its place, he carried something quieter and far more stable, a sense of coherence that did not depend on approval or certainty, only on the courage to remain honest. The story of that wedding faded into memory for the world, becoming another chapter in a long public life. For Tom, however, it remained a turning point not because of what happened, but because of what he chose not to ignore. He learned that silence could be a teacher rather than a threat, that stillness could reveal rather than diminish, and that the bravest decisions are often the least visible. As dawn approached once more, light touched the horizon gently, and Tom felt no urge to capture the moment, explain it, or share it beyond those who were present. He simply watched, breathing evenly, grounded in the understanding that peace does not arrive when life becomes perfect, but when we stop demanding perfection from ourselves. And in that quiet certainty, as the world continued on without needing his explanation, Tom knew that whatever came next would be faced not as a performance, but as a person, fully present, fully aware, and finally at peace.